So Amanda, tell me a little bit about what got you into psychology to begin with. What was the pull to do what you're doing now?
Well, aside from getting an easy A in Psych 101 when I was in college, I had actually been working at a residential treatment facility while I was in school, and started working with at-risk youth at a very young age, and it just kind of, there was like a natural kind of then transition for me to be like, oh, I really like doing this. Can this go from a part-time job while I'm in school to something more permanent? So I switched my major to psychology and kind of started studying it in school while I was still like in the real classroom of working with these kids that were in state custody for various reasons. They had violated the law, their parents had given up, they were taken away from their parents or whatever it was. And it just was like, it was a very like natural progression. It wasn't really anything, it was very organic. It wasn't anything where I woke up one day and said, I'm gonna be a psychologist.
Was there ever a point in your training where you could actually see then you becoming a psychologist? Were there times perhaps as a student and then doing that you were able to see your professors or whatever and then being able to emulate that? Or would you say your experience was continually organic? Do you feel like it just kind of...
Yeah, it was continually organic for me because I stopped after my bachelor's degree, which we all know does you no good. And
They don't tell you that beforehand.
No, I kept working in the field. I kept working in group homes and classrooms, like special ed classrooms, and eventually was just like, well, all right, let me go back to school, get my master's degree, and kind of go from there. And that's how I ended up in autism services. But then at that point, I was like, well, this isn't all that I want to do. And one of my professors said to me, well, like, have you ever thought about getting a doctorate? And I said, oh God, no. And then, but then after he said that to me, well, I think you should consider it. It kind of planted a seed. And a couple years later, I was like, well, let me just go get this doctorate so that I can continue to be in this field and not be limited in what I do within this field.
Go ahead.
Well, then I was going to say, and then I always had like this interest in social justice, and so it kind of started to become this very natural like intersection between, how do mental health issues and mental health in general and well-being, affect the way that our society is stratified and layered, and started to become like, well, there seem to be some people that don't have good outcomes because of certain mental health issues combined with where they are at in our society. And so then that's kind of...
So I was just going to ask, and that seems to be, you're already speaking of that, who are you serving now? You share a little bit what populations you're serving currently.
So I work with the Department of Corrections. I'm a psychological associate there, and I work with inmate populations, providing individual therapy, group therapy, crisis intervention, and just whatever other kind of mental health services they might be needing in the prison system. So that could be mental health trainings for officers, that could be peer support, and just in general kind of providing those services for the inmate population.
What do people across the state, other Wisconsinites, need to know about who our convicts are? What brings people to the point that they're incarcerated, and who you're serving? How could we maybe help other people around the state understand this population?
That's a huge question, right? And there's a lot of things that lead to people to be incarcerated. In my personal experience, though, I would say there's a huge intersection between trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and the eventuality that somebody is going to be incarcerated. Not to say that if you have a traumatized childhood, that's what's going to happen to you, but there are almost no inmates that I work with that I can say had a supportive, well-adjusted, loving, safe upbringing.
Yeah.
Most of the guys that I work with have experienced some kind of trauma, whether that's direct trauma, direct abuse, or that kind of growing up in a very violent environment, neighborhood wise, it's not safe to go outside, or they grew up in gangs or what have you, or even if you get outside of the inner city, even kind of looking at rural populations and the abuse that happens there, the violence that happens there, the drug abuse. Even we don't tend to think of it like this, but if you're a child growing up in a home where there's chronic drug abuse by your caregivers, that's a traumatic experience.
Sure. Right.
So it doesn't even have to, we think of it as being violence or exposure to violence, but neglect and psychological abuse can be just as damaging. So I think adverse childhood experience plays a huge role.
What do people need to get back into community then? What you mentioned social justice and those types of issues I think are important is, and as a psychologist and someone serving people with such high need, what do we need to do in society to allow convicts and felons who are trying to reintegrate?
Aside from completely changing societal structure altogether, well, reintegration is actually really great, because right now I think that for many of our inmates, the deck is stacked against them upon reentry. So they often they go away for however long their prison sentence is. They're cut off from their family. Sometimes we send them entirely across the state where nobody can get any visitors from anybody they know or love. So they're in prison. They're cut off from their family. They are accruing money that they owe because of court fees or restitution or back pay for child support. Not that our guys shouldn't pay child support. Of course, we want them to take responsibility for that. But they're accruing these exorbitant costs. They are not earning very much money in the prison system, 26 cents an hour if they get a job. And they're coming out thousands and thousands of dollars in debt, and they're not connected with their family anymore, and they have nowhere to live, and they have a felony. So there are certain work avenues that are closed to them, and they have mental health issues, and we're releasing them with 2 weeks worth of medication and no follow-up in the community. So I think there's got to be a way to offer more support, and whether that's through job programs, mental health treatment, maybe not stigmatizing them, like if someone is done with their sentence, kind of there's this mentality like, well, they're a felon, and it's like, well, yeah, sure, but they've also served their time, and so like, do we want to keep putting them back into the system and absorbing the cost that way as taxpayers, or do we want to provide programs that are actually aimed at rehabilitation and reintegration, where instead of absorbing the cost, they're now becoming productive members that have been reintegrated into society, instead of individuals that are just draining the taxpayer's pocketbook, so to speak.
You feel you're in a field that you're planning on sticking with? Is this you speak pretty passionately, you feel a calling to serve people right now that are in the system?
Yeah, I think I think that's where I've naturally migrated to, and this is where I've been the happiest thus far. I've been in the field in various capacities now for 20 years, and this is probably the place that I feel the most satisfied in. I hope to continue to work with underserved populations, not just necessarily inmates. I do like working with the inmate population. I see myself there for a long time. But I really do like working with underserved populations in general. So maybe populations that don't have access to good health care and mental health providers that can really do some good for them, as opposed to people with insurance that can kind of go out and get whatever they need whenever they need it. I think I would rather stick with this population that maybe can't or doesn't know how to, or even that they need services to begin with.
Sure.
So
And it sounds in a lot of ways you've come then full circle. You were serving young, when you were young and starting off, you were serving people kind of in challenge and in need, and now you're finding yourself, it seems to be back full circle again. My last question is, I'm curious about, as you're working with an individual case, and you imagine can't see always happy endings, what gives you contentment in your job? What feels successful when you're feeling like you're making an impact? What does that look like in a typical week or day?
Yeah, I think because the cards are so stacked against us in corrections in general, I think that understanding that that some of these guys aren't going to make it is imperative to not going crazy. Understanding that, like, you're not going to be the one that saves everybody, right? There's a certain amount of industry that people need to act on themselves, right? Like, you can't save people. It has to be a collaborative effort, and that it's not your fault if somebody goes back into the system or doesn't make it, but that if you even do help one person come back, that's a victory. Because that's not just one person, that's one person's life and their kid's life and their family's life, and maybe they're going to go out and make a difference for somebody else at some point. So there is no, with these populations, there is no small victory. You know, if you are only helping one person at a time and you only help 1 out of 50, that's still significant to that person and the people in that person's life.
Cool. Thanks a lot for sharing and adding a little bit more perspective here.